It's a little over 2 weeks until the last day of voting in California's recall election, and one of the biggest blue states in the country is in danger of losing its Democratic governor. Why is this happening? What's on the ballot? And what are the national implications? I'm glad to be joined by a reporter with CalMatters, a fantastic nonprofit news outlet here in California. Ben Christopher covers politics and elections and is covering this recount. Ben, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
So, first question is I don't know how current the polling is, but can you give us a generic sense of the state of the race right now? And is Governor Newsom, the Democrat, in danger of losing?
Yeah, there haven't been very many recent statewide polls, not for a few weeks at least, but the most recent ones all show basically the same pattern, which is that if you survey registered voters on the whole, a majority or roughly a majority do not support removing Governor Gavin Newsom from office. But when you ask likely voters, these are the respondents who say they plan to vote, or they've been following the election closely, or they're enthusiastic about it. It's basically neck and neck. And basically every major statewide poll shows some version of that. And so what that means is that the people who are really fired up to vote in this election are disproportionately people who want to see Newsom out. And there are a lot of Democrats who, at least as of a few weeks ago, haven't really been paying attention, or they don't think it's that important, or they don't really think it's going to be very close. And so there's this what's been termed an enthusiasm gap. And so that's why, if you are outside of California, or even if you are inside California and you're thinking like, wait, I thought California was really this stridently blue state. How could it be that we might be ejecting our sitting governor, who's a Democrat, and perhaps replacing him with a Republican? That's really one of the main reasons why, is because there is that sort of lopsided enthusiasm. And so when you turn to what the Newsom camp is doing, what the anti-recall camp is doing, they're really doing their best to try and gin up enthusiasm. They're bringing out big personalities. Vice President Harris is coming out to the state. They're really leaning on organized grassroots efforts to sort of get out the vote. And they're really relying on partisanship and fear, for lack of a better word. So since day one, when you hear from the governor, he's been calling this a Republican recall. Stop the Republican Recall is the name of the committee that they formed. And they're really trying to characterize it as a Republican-led effort, which is, I think, mostly, but maybe not entirely true. And that's because, again, if you can just get the plurality of voters in California who are registered Democrats outnumber Republicans almost 2-1. If you can just get them sort of tap into those partisan instincts and get them to turn out, then there's no chance that the governor will be recalled. And then most recently, and I'm sure we'll get into the individual candidates who are running, there's Larry Elder, who's the front runner, who's a very combative, charismatic talk show radio host. He's with very conservative views. And so because of that he's basically, the Newsom camp won't stop talking about him, basically, because they are trying to frame this race between Gavin Newsom and not Gavin Newsom and a generic recall, but Gavin Newsom and Larry Elder, the latest incarnation of President Trump. And their calculation is that if voters see this is a battle between those two ideologies, between those two partisan identities, then Californians who are sympathetic to Newsom, but maybe aren't particularly enthusiastic about him, that they will turn out. And so that's really what we see playing out right now.
Let me ask you about the ballot, because itself, a lot of people I'm talking to in California find the ballot confusing. Can you explain, what does it take for Gavin Newsom to stay in the job? And then what's on the ballot? Can you clear up some of this confusion?
Sure. Yeah, this is a huge source of confusion for a lot of voters, which I know because I get emails about this constantly, including from my own family members. So this is unusual for us Californians too. It's not a straightforward process. On the recall ballot, there are two questions. So the first one is, do you want to recall the governor or not? Yes or no. It's just a binary. And then if you want to keep Newsom in office, you vote no. And then if you want to see him fired, you vote yes. Then there's the second question, which is, if the governor is recalled, who should take his place? And a weird feature of the ballot or the recall procedure in California is that Newsom is not on the replacement list. So he can't run to replace himself. And there are 46 other people on that ballot. And whoever gets the most votes of that list will become the governor if a majority of voters vote yes on that first question. And so it's sort of this two-step process where if a majority of voters vote no on that first question, then it's over. It doesn't matter how people vote on the second question. But if a majority of voters vote to recall the governor, then whoever gets the most votes on that second question becomes governor. And you can imagine a situation in which, say, 49% of Californians vote no on the recall, 51% vote yes. And so the recall goes through. And then because there are so many candidates who are running, and there isn't a single front runner, the way that we had one in 2003 with Arnold Schwarzenegger. There's no Arnold Schwarzenegger running this time. There's no Terminator. And so you could have a candidate who gets 20%, 25% of the vote on that second question, and they could win. And so you have this kind of strange outcome where 49% of the electorate wants to keep Newsom in office, and the candidate who wins gets 25% of the vote. So in effect, the next governor wins fewer votes than were cast in support of the current governor. And so that's why you do actually have some constitutional law experts questioning the constitutionality of this procedure. And beyond that, there's a lot of talk, given the California legislature has a supermajority of Democrats. There's a lot of talk, regardless of how this things go on September 14th, to sort of rethink and change this process.
I understand the Newsom camp is advising people to vote no on the first question and then not touch the second question. Apparently, He needs to get 50 votes plus one vote to stay in office. Can you explain their logic and what is the Republican side advising?
Sure. Yeah. So this is another source of confusion, because what the Newsom campaign is saying is, just vote no. Just vote no on the first question, and that's it. You don't need to consider who to choose as a replacement candidate. And I think a lot of voters, particularly Democrats, voters who are sympathetic to the governor, believe that that means that they should vote no. And then if they vote for a replacement, that would somehow cancel their no vote. That is not the case. So if there are any California voters who are watching this and are confused about this, you are totally allowed to vote for one or both of the questions, and both of your votes will be counted. The strategy I think that the Newsom campaign is pursuing here is just simplicity. You don't have to talk through this sort of two-step process. For them, the entire game is just making sure that a majority of voters vote no. And if they do that, then it's over. And so what they're just saying is just vote no and don't consider an alternative. There's also a more subtle strategy involved here, which is that if they were to single out a replacement candidate, someone who they think is acceptable, then they would, I think the thinking is that they would be validating this process and perhaps giving some voters the idea that, hey, we could vote yes for the recall and end up with this more acceptable candidate. And so, yeah, maybe I like Newsom, but I like this other person better, so I'm going to vote yes and then vote for the recall. So I think what they're just trying to say by, again, encouraging people not to even consider a replacement by calling it a Republican recall, stop the Republican recall, they're just trying to say that you're either going to vote no, or you're voting, or if you vote yes, then we're going to have a Republican governor. And so I think that's the strategy. Obviously, go ahead.
On the Republican side, the Republican National Committee has decided not to endorse, or Republicans broadly, any of the Republican candidates running. What's that strategy about?
Well, so in California, there's the California Republican Party. They took a vote on whether to endorse any of the candidates. There are about 5 potential candidates who are sort of viable in the polls right now. And I'm not sure if it was as much of a strategy as it was just a fact that there isn't that Arnold Schwarzenegger figure. There isn't someone who's really galvanized and sort of gathered all of the right of center voters or anti-Newsom voters behind them. And so at least in the case of the California GOP, which held their endorsement vote 2 weeks ago, they just couldn't get, the field was too fractured. The bar for an endorsement was set at 60% of the party delegates. It was too high. They just couldn't get behind someone. So I think that was less of a strategic decision and more just a consequence of the fact that there are a lot of candidates running and there's a lot of fractured support. Now, that isn't to say that everyone is doing equally. I think what that means, that lack of endorsement implicitly means that the front runner, at least according to the most recent polls, again, we haven't seen too many statewide polls recently, is Larry Elder. He remains the front runner by anywhere between a few percentage points or 10 percentage points, depending on which poll you look at. And again, he is a somewhat more prominent talk radio personality who's been on talk radio and also on TV and documentaries and writing books in conservative media for over 2 decades. And so he just kind of came into the race as a more known quantity. And for that reason, I think, and because he's a very sort of bombastic and charismatic character, he's out front.
Would you tell us a little bit more about Larry Elder's politics? His stance on the issues is at odds with the majority of California voters.
I think that's fair to say, yeah. So Larry Elder is this longtime conservative talk radio show host. He came up in the early to mid 90s, around the same time as Rush Limbaugh, and he's very much in that vein. He's very confrontational. He really thrives on saying things that are controversial, and his politics on economic issues are very libertarian. He describes it as libertarian with a small L, meaning not Libertarian Party. He is a registered Republican, but he doesn't believe in very much regulation. He thinks taxes should be as low and simple as possible. He has said that he doesn't believe in a minimum wage should not exist. Lots of labor protections should be eliminated. Very skeptical or critical rather of public sector unions, of public education in general, believes that there should be much larger role for vouchers that could be used for private schools or charter schools or religious schools. And then also a lot of his persona has been based on the idea of race. And I think for people who haven't seen him, it's worth pointing out that one of the things that distinguishes Larry Elder from many other prominent personalities in sort of right-wing media is that he's Black. And he has really crafted a persona and a personality as someone who, tells it like it is, as he would put it, and is very critical of the idea that racism plays a major role in American politics or shaping outcomes, and is very much talks about how very critical of democratic or liberal Black political figures who would attribute disparate outcomes within Black and brown communities to anything but personal responsibility. So he's a very contentious figure, obviously. With that comes, I think, his base level of popularity that he has garnered. But obviously, you can see why, from the Newsom campaign's perspective, because a lot of these positions are outside the mainstream California politics, the Newsom campaign and the governor himself have been very eager to just make this all about Larry Elder.
For people who are just dialing into this now and haven't been paying attention, would you just big picture explain why is Gavin Newsom facing a recall?
It's a good question. So I think there are a couple of answers to that question. One is the pandemic. Governor Gavin Newsom received a lot of praise, I think, early on for the handling of the pandemic, being much more aggressive in calling for lockdowns. And if we think back to May or April of 2020, for a brief moment of time, those weren't enormously partisan issues. There was a lot of public appetite for actually taking a strong position and really taking a role in directing an aggressive public health response, particularly given that we weren't really seeing that kind of leadership from the federal government. But as the pandemic has gone on for months and months, and as these lockdowns or other restrictions on public life have persisted, including schools and businesses, there's become a much more a larger contingent of Californians who were not happy with the governor. I think on top of that, there are some other factors, one of which is that California, it just happens to be relatively easy to recall elected officials. It's easier than virtually in any other state, which isn't to say it's simple, but you only need 12% of the voters in the most recent election to sign a petition. And then on top of that, there are these sort of immediate impacts, which is that, one, because of the pandemic, the petitioners for this particular recall effort, which was actually started before the pandemic, so it's worth pointing that out. If you look at the petition that they were handing out, it said nothing about the pandemic. It was more about Governor Gavin Newsom's handling of the death penalty and criminal justice issues and some more sort of traditional Republican criticisms of him. But because of the pandemic, they asked for and were granted an extension on that petition gathering period. So they were given an additional few months to gather those signatures. And then on top of that, I'm sure a lot of your viewers have heard of the French Laundry affair, which was when Governor Gavin Newsom went to this very Tony restaurant in Napa Valley with some lobbyists. He wasn't wearing a mask. This was sort of at the height of when he was calling on other Californians not to do that, not to go out to restaurants and not to go maskless. And so there was that sort of that sense of hypocrisy, which I think just kind of turbocharged the whole effort. And so I think it's all of those different factors came together, and that's why we're here.
This is a statewide election, but it also has national implications. And this is something of a delicate question to address. But there is a senator in the state, Dianne Feinstein, who's quite old. She's pushing 90. Would you talk to us a little bit about why this very election could, in theory, change the balance of power in the Senate?
Yeah, that's right. So in California, governors have the power to appoint a vacancy, should there be a vacancy at a U.S. Senate seat, or also any of the constitutional officers in California. And so again, not to put too fine a point on it, but Senator Dianne Feinstein is 88 years old, and she has said that she plans to serve out the remainder of her term, which ends in 2022. But should the recall be successful, and should a Republican take Governor Gavin Newsom's place, if there were a Senate vacancy, in either Senate seat for that matter, the new governor, a Republican, would have the opportunity to fill it. And given that Democrats hold the slimmest possible majority in the US Senate, that could, of course, flip the Senate from Democratic to Republican control. And this is, of course, something that the governor and the opponents of the recall have been really trying to hammer home to California's Democratic voters. I mentioned this sort of enthusiasm gap earlier, and this is one of their talking points that they've really been making. Like, maybe you're not used to paying close attention to politics in 2021 in the middle of September. Maybe you don't care about what happens in Sacramento, but you do care about what happens in Washington, D.C. And if you care about the success of the Biden administration, this is the point, then you have to vote for the recall. So there's clearly a national relevance to this election, and it's certainly something that the Newsom campaign is emphasizing.
Given all that, putting on your political analyst hat, can you explain, or do you have a theory why California Democrats are not more engaged, given that it could change the balance of power in the Senate, that they could lose a Democratic governor? Why aren't Democrats fired up about getting out to vote?
It's a good question. I think, we'll know more the more that we see polls, and obviously when the election results come in, we'll know how much of this enthusiasm gap was just sort of a temporary phenomenon, or if it's really something that's going to plague the governor for the weeks to come. I think Democrats are always a little bit later to tune in to elections in general, and so that could be part of it. I think another factor is just the very nature of the recall. I think because it is just an up-down vote, that first question is, do you want to get rid of the governor or not? It sort of lends itself more to enthusiasm from people who really want to get rid of Governor Newsom, particularly because the petition itself was a grassroots effort on the part of people who want to get rid of the governor, and those tend to be Republicans. And so I think that's part of it. Just the sort of the very nature of the recall sort of biases in that direction. I think one thing that will be interesting, and one of the reasons it's probably premature to sort of say that this enthusiasm gap is long lasting, is that, another odd quirk of this election is that, like in 2020, every registered voter is going to get a ballot in the mail. And so even if you're someone who really hasn't been paying attention and doesn't have any plan to vote, getting a ballot in the mail is a pretty good reminder. It's a pretty visceral reminder, like, oh yeah, there's an election. I think I've seen an ad about that. And so I think it is still possible, and particularly now that the governor he's outraised the competition by millions and millions of dollars. They are spending a ton of money. As I mentioned, Kamala Harris is coming to the state. The President Biden might even come and visit. And so we could certainly see that reverse itself within the coming weeks.
You anticipated my next question was going to be about every Californian getting their ballot. So in the broad scope of things, why does California recall governors and electeds more than other states? Is it just because it's easier, the way you described earlier, it's easier to do it here?
Yeah, and we shouldn't overstate it, because this has only happened once before, right? This happened in 2003. We all know Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was successful in the 2003 recall of Democrat Gray Davis. And so it's not like this happens all the time, although we are seeing recall efforts sprout up around the state at the local level as well. But I do think, yes, structurally, it is just a lot easier to do this in California. And maybe because of that, there is sort of a culture of direct democracy. We always have.
Who backed this recall? How did it start? Who are the funders behind it?
So it started off as sort of a small effort, honestly. A man named Orrin Heatley is a retired sheriff up in Northern California. He started it. Again, this had nothing to do with the pandemic, because it was launched in February of 2020, before the pandemic was really a major issue, as just one of many recall efforts against the governor. This is the one of 6 that have been launched against the governor. And I think it was just sort of an accident of history that they were able to secure this extension on the petition signature just as the news of the French Laundry was coming out, and it just came together to be successful. Of course, since then.
Can I pause you that what you're saying
Yeah.
is they had more time to gather signatures to recall the governor than
right.
the law would necessarily allow for because of COVID.
That's
So
right.
if COVID hadn't given them that extension, they might not have gotten the signatures.
That's right. If COVID and a Sacramento judge hadn't granted it, that's right. So that there was sort of a proactive decision there. And so that's part of it. And obviously, absent COVID, it's very unlikely that any of this would have happened, because there wouldn't be so much animosity towards the governor. And so since then, now that it became sort of a viable campaign, it started attracting much more support from the California Republican Party, from national Republican figures, and he started getting funding from some large donors like Mike Huckabee and his political action committee donated a fair amount of money. You see a lot of money from traditional Republican donors throughout California as well. And so it has just become, as it's sort of taken on this momentum, it's become much more of a sort of a traditional Republican effort.
And last question, do we know, does a high turnout help Governor Newsom or help the Republicans?
If I had to guess, I would say high turnout would help the governor, just because Democrats, both in general and also in this election in particular, Democratic voters tend to be less likely to turn out during off-year elections. And so the higher turnout elections, where you have lots of young voters and you have lots of voters of color and voters who are not as reliable voters, that tends to be better news for Democrats.
I should say, does it help the Republicans and other candidates? Because there are many that aren't Republicans who are running. I cannot let this end without asking you about Caitlyn Jenner, because people want to know, does Caitlyn have a chance?
According to recent polls, I would say it's not looking great for Caitlyn Jenner. She obviously came into this race with a ton of name recognition. Most people know who Caitlyn Jenner is, but I guess it just goes to show that name recognition isn't everything. She hasn't really been able to carve out a niche for herself. I think it's fair to say that among voters who are very skeptical of Gavin Newsom, who lean Republican, and who might want to support a transgender activist, that's a very niche electorate.
Well, speaking of name recognition, yours is a name we should know, Ben Christopher with CalMatters. Thank you for your time and your insight.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Jessica Yellin. If you like this video, please click subscribe, and you can click the bell to get notifications when we post new content. Thanks for watching.